Okay, here is the second installment of the video lecture for Chapter 3. This is the last slide that you saw. And now we're moving on to the next person, Herbert Gons. And probably I will be sending you a reading from Mr. Gons at some point. I'll probably scan it and send it to you maybe this weekend as it will apply to this class. So you can be on the lookout for that. Gons asserted that cities were mosaics of many lifestyles, and he basically asserts four different types of urban lifestyles. You have the cosmopolites or the cosmopolites. I've heard it pronounced both ways. You have the unmarried or childless. You have ethnic villagers, and then you have the deprived and the trapped. I know the D got cut off there, but it's trapped. We'll start with the first group, the cosmopolites. And I believe these are mentioned in your book, but you want to make sure you have this in your notes. These folks are highly educated urban sophisticates. These are the more well-off, the upper crust, if you will, of the urban social status ladder, if you will, who choose to live in the city. They're not stuck there. They're not poor and can't get out. They choose to live there because of the city's wide range of activities, experiences, and social contacts. A lot of times you see artists, musicians, writers, and my word students again kind of got cut off. Sorry about that. The next group you have are the unmarried or the childless. Now you can have some overlap with some of these groups according to Gons. So you have some overlap with the cosmopolites. These include single adults, couples without children. If you think about it, it's an economic issue. If you're single, you have more disposable income than you would if you were married and had dependents like children. Same with couples, married or not. The more children you have, the more money that you have tied into that, and the less disposable income that you have. So these people can afford city life because it's more expensive to live in cities than it is to live in the suburbs or even out in the exurbs or the rural areas. The third group, you have the ethnic villagers. The ethnic villagers sustain many rural patterns within the city. A lot of times they claim local areas, emphasizing tradition, religious beliefs, family ties, even displaying a suspicion of people who are quote-unquote outsiders. And we talked about this. There's another name for these groups. They're called enclaves. And we'll talk about those more in depth as we progress through the class. But you see this, and I've seen it. I mentioned in class traveling to New York City. If you've been to a major city, maybe you have little pockets of ethnic areas like Little Italy, Little China, Little Russia, where you have basically these little cultures that exist. They speak the language, they adhere to the customs that are often quite traditional and even rural in terms of the way they feel. And these pockets exist within really big, diverse cities that are very densely populated. And then the last group you have are the deprived and the trapped. Gons says these are people who they were born there, more than likely. They're stuck there. They can't afford to get out, then that's where they're at. They could be very poor, handicapped, people from broken family situations. You see a large concentration of ethnic minorities in cities, especially inner cities, who have the motivation, they have the internal drive to get out, to move out of the city, maybe to get to the suburbs or get somewhere, better, but they can't. They lack the money and the funds to do so. There's a reading, like I said a few minutes ago, I'm going to send you, called The Uses of Poverty, the Poor Pay All. It's a very functionalist. We talked about functionalism as a theory when we started talking about this unit in the first PowerPoint with this. It's a really interesting take on poverty, and Gons makes the argument that poverty serves very specific functions. Now, when we think of poverty, we think, well, that's not a good thing. We don't want people to be poor. But a functionalist perspective says, well, you need poor people to make society work, especially in cities. So you can look for that reading, and we'll deal with that later. So the idea of functionalism comes back into play. And again, functionalism is a theory purports that society is sort of analogous to an organism. Like I said earlier, like the human body. If you may have a smooth-running organism, a smooth-running city, but all the parts have to be working correctly. You could be perfectly healthy, but if your head is pounding, it's going to impact the way your whole body is, the entire way that you function during the course of a day. Okay, so The next person that I want to talk about is Irving Goffman. Goffman lived from 1922 to 1982. He talks about the social rules that pedestrians observe. He did some research on Vietnam and road norms versus American road norms. He was interested in people's behaviors in cities, especially densely populated pockets within cities. And one of the things he talks about, I don't know if it's in the textbook or not, is in Vietnam, basically, essentially, nobody really has the right of way. You just kind of, people would walk out into the streets. Within our culture, when the pedestrian walks out into a busy street, cars stop. The pedestrian kind of always has the proverbial right of way, if not the legitimate right of way. We don't run over people who are on foot in our vehicles. Not in our culture necessarily, but in other parts of the world, it's not like that. I saw this firsthand in parts of Europe when I traveled overseas. I was riding with, we had a driver who was taking us around. We were in one of these little villages because we obviously couldn't drive in Europe. And the driver would literally nudge people with his car on the road to kind of help them along, if you will. And I remember being horrified, thinking, this guy's going to run over somebody. What's going to happen? But it was very normative. European escalator riders. We have a tendency to kind of stand, if we're going on an escalator or riding on an escalator in this country, to kind of stand on the right. If we want to walk up, if we want to kind of skip up, there's a certain way that we do that. So he was interested in this stuff. Lynn Laughlin, she's still alive, so we don't want to give her a date of death because she's still kicking, as far as we know. Talks about a world of strangers. If you travel to a city, you look at a lot of different people, faces. We can categorize them. We can try to classify people. But really, you've got a lot of people that you don't really know. I mean, it's not like a rural setting where you might run into 20 people and know 18 of them, if not all of them. You don't know people in the city. You may encounter hundreds, maybe thousands of people during the course of your day walking the streets in the city, going from building to building, restaurants, whatever. She says that individual appearance and dress you can identify people by social standing this way. People who wear suits, you can identify these people as being, in the business district or, having a lot of money. Visual cues to classify strangers in much the same way we make sense of the city's physical environment. It's kind of like stereotyping. And we have to, with all the stimulation around us, we have to depend on these visual cues to sort of classify these strangers. Okay, these are prostitutes, these are homeless people, these are business people, these are industrial workers, whatever. And it just kind of helps us make sense of what we see. Laughlin also talks about privatizing public space. Musicians, yuppies, alcoholics, the homeless, homosexuals, outsiders, all these groups of people, again, making sense of a world of strangers, all these groups of people tend to kind of stake a claim to a specific area of the city, and they kind of claim it as their own. You can think about it, even in Charleston. I mean, we have the part of Charleston that's considered the artistic side, or the homosexual part of town, or maybe the business district. We talk about the east end of Charleston versus the west end. So there are some stereotypes that are built into this stuff as well. Other factors, according to Laughlin, that help us perceive and make sense of urban spaces or places include, obviously, social class. We can almost look at people based on appearance and try to figure out where they fit in the social class system. Also race. We do it in terms of age as well. And I've hit a nice stopping point. We'll call this the end of part 2 for this video lecture. Thank you.